Hello folks, today I'm going to go through your rope solo questions that you posed to me on a recent video that I brought out of me soloing a route in Glopedalen. There were loads of really good questions on there. I've got all the questions down here. I'll give you some answers. As you can see, we're in our new studio setup. We've got our favourite climber over here, the Big O, on some alpine route. So he's going to sort of bring inspiration and help us along for the rope soloing questions. So the first question: how to start rope soloing? Do you do it on a super easy route? Do you do it with a partner? How do you start safely? So the way I started rope soloing was actually by reading a book by Andy Kirkpatrick called Me, Myself and I. And I actually I had no idea about rope soloing, how to do it, systems, what to do. I read that book cover to cover, and then I just went out, started practicing on some easy things, and then gradually progressed harder and harder, kind of like you would do with any normal standard climbing really. But I would say that book, Me, Myself and I, was the really good thing of how I learned the systems and basically how rope soloing worked. So are the falls different rope soloing to normal belaying? Yes, they are slightly different. I would say that if you're quite close to the belay, then it can be a little more of a sort of like a shock fall. It's coming directly onto a piece of, like onto your belay, onto a piece of gear. If you're further out from the belay, then generally you can have a little bit more, I always think there's a little bit more slack than you realise in the system. So I generally think you can fall a bit further on a rope solo than with a normal belayer. Okay, how to set up a rope solo. So everybody's got different setups with a rope soloing system. The way I do it is I use my belay. So I'll have an upward pulling belay. This could either be on bolts or a built trad belay in an upward pull direction. When your piece of gear catches you up here and you fall, then the belay is going to pull up. The only time you would pull down on the belay is if you took a factor 2 fall onto the belay. So if you totally stripped the pitch of gear and you fell straight onto the belay. And now if you had an upward pulling belay in that situation, let's say it was made of wires for example, and it was an upward pulling belay, you stripped your pitch, there is a risk of you then stripping the belay from pulling the wires downwards. So in that case, it's actually really important to also have the belay in a downward pulling direction as well. So you want an upwards and downward pulling direction. So the next thing that I would look at for setting up a good rope solo system is the device that you're using. Now the device that I use is something called a silent partner, quite difficult to get hold of these days. Below that I have a Traxion, and that essentially keeps the weight of the spare rope off the device so it's feeding well and properly. What you can do is you could also add an extra belay loop or a piece of cord to the harness, so you have a backup of that belay loop if you wanted to, because it is only through the belay loop. So if your belay loop failed, then you would totally fall out the system. With the Traxion, I always tend to put this below the solo device, because that way you can reach it with both hands. Now some people like to have it on a gear loop either side, but I've found when I've been doing this and you're actually on pitches that are at your limit, then actually reaching around your harness when you're climbing to feed rope when it's on the wrong side is actually quite tricky, which is why I like to have it in the centre so you can reach it with both hands. So how did I learn to rope solo? I guess I covered this, but I read the book Me, Myself and I, and then I just went and practiced and practiced and practiced. The first place I climbed was the Peak District, and that was single pitch climbs, and that was more to figure out the actual technique of climbing, feeding rope, managing it whilst you're climbing a pitch. And then after that, I actually made a trip to Squamish. That was more to figure out the systems of swapping over at belays, how to manage the rope properly, where to clip it into, and the quickest way to basically go from pitch to pitch. So how much would a rope soloing setup cost you? That really depends on the solo device that you get. I use the silent partner. Very hard to come by these days, and if you do come by one, then it's probably going to cost you more than your house. But there are other lots of other solo devices on the market. Another popular one is the Gri Gri. So they're not too, that's just like a normal piece of climbing gear, not too expensive. The best and safest solo devices but not the silent partner. Yeah, I do think the silent partner is probably the best and the safest. It's got a double attachment point, and it's the only solo device that is, or one of only the solo devices which is built for solo climbing. So other than the silent partner, I've only used the Gri Gri and the Revo. I've used both to decent effect. It would be hard to say, you know, which one is the safest, to be honest. I mean, they're both devices that aren't made for rope soloing, but do work for rope soloing. So am I still using the silent partner, and have I considered moving to anything newer such as the Revo? Yes, I am still using the silent partner, but I have used the Revo in the past for more sort of like faster and lighter solo missions. So when I was soloing both Half Dome and El Cap in a single day, then I used the Revo. I just wanted something a little bit lighter. I was also doing quite a lot of aid climbing on that, or daisy soloing, and I just wanted something to sort of back me up in a way. But when I'm doing hard free climbing and there's the higher percentage or possibility of falling off, then I always revert back and go back to the silent partner. What would be my second choice of device if I didn't have the silent partner? I think, to be honest, I would probably try and get into using the Gri Gri. I know something like the Gri Gri Plus has a lead and top rope mode on it, and if you switch the lead mode, then the rope feeds out the device much smoother. So pros and cons of the solo devices that I have used. If we start with the silent partner, which is my main solo device, if we look at the pros, then it's got a double attachment point. It's actually built for soloing. It feeds rope really well. It's the smoothest one I've used, and it also catches the fall in any orientation or direction. The cons, I guess, are that it is quite big and bulky and a little bit heavy. It's sort of like jangling around. It can be a little bit annoying, let's put it that way, because it's kind of big and heavy. What else have we got? The Revo. This isn't built for rope soloing, so I would say that is a negative. One of the things that I have found with the Revo is that some little catchers on the side, these are used to help lock the rope. But what I've found is that when you're climbing, these can actually flick up and down without you being aware, and then suddenly you can't feed yourself rope. Also with the Revo, you only have one attachment point. With that, I would actually recommend using something like a Mayon or steel carabiner when you've taken a fall on them, to be very varied in length before it locks up. So sometimes it, you know, locks up completely instantly, and then other times you're just like falling, and then just like. In terms of the Gri Gri, I think the pros and cons are pretty similar to the Revo, other than I think a fall with the Gri Gri, because it's a different system for catching. It's done on friction rather than like the rotation of something spinning. The Gri Gri maybe is slightly more consistent in the size of fall or the time it takes to lock up the device when it catches you. But in terms of the other pros and cons, I think it's probably pretty similar. It is a little bit smaller, so it's a little bit lighter, but then, you know, on the negative side, you've only got one attachment point. Yeah, all the kind of things that I went through with the other one. So how do I set up the anchor to start climbing on a rope solo? It's very easy. If it's bolted belay, I will just clip 2 carabiners to the bolted belay and then make like a bunny ears. If it's a trad climbing anchor, this is a little bit more complicated because you have to think about all the different scenarios. So usually you would just go with an upward pull direction. Like I mentioned before, if there's a chance of taking a factor 2 onto the belay, you also need to have it in a downward pull direction, because you can end yourself in a very sticky situation. If I have got a trad climbing anchor and I've got my main master point coming to a point here, I'll clip my rope into it, but then I will also have the very end of the rope clipped into another carabiner, just so that the rope isn't clipped solely into one master point carabiner. It's basically, that's where the main load is going onto that, but then I've got a backup and it'll be clipped just into another piece of gear or somewhere else in the anchor, so that I've got the rope clipped into 2 pieces and it's not just on one carabiner. Because you can do all these things of like, oh, I've got double carabiners on my harness, I've got extra loops here, but then you just clip the rope solely into one carabiner on the belay, and then there's no point in doing all the other stuff, is there? You you may as well be in 2 points everywhere. If I didn't have a silent partner, what would I use? I think what I would try and use is what I mentioned before, which is, I think it's the Gri Gri Plus, and I would use that in lead mode. Is it lead mode? The one which feeds rope more easily. It's going to be lead mode, isn't it? Because you want to feed rope more easily. How is it climbing with the silent partner compared to a Gri Gri setup? And like I say, I haven't really used the Gri Gri setup that much. When I have used it, I haven't got the systems right properly. So to be honest, I've found it like total nightmare. And that's basically because I just haven't practiced with it and haven't got the system set up. I'm sure I would get used to it and it would become my sort of go-to method if I didn't have a silent partner. So this is an interesting question. So this is in relation to the video that I put out about the rope solo and Glopedalen. I mentioned about placing a piece of gear above the belay to redirect the rope through it so that the belay wasn't sagging back down and you could keep it in that upward direction pull. This person is asking, would I clove hitch into that piece? And again, yes, you could pull the rope tight so the anchor stayed upwards, have that piece hang downwards, and just clove hitch into that piece. How do I manage security when soloing? Preparation. So I would say when I'm climbing with a partner, I do 50% sort of rely on them a little bit for the preparations. You're sort of a little bit more relaxed about what you're taking in the gear and you're sort of chatting it between you. But when you're going out by yourself, you're on it and you know exactly what gear you need to bring, and I make sure I have the rack sort of set out. I go through everything individually. The next thing I'll do, which I think is really important, is to check the weather, and then double check the weather, and then triple check the weather, and then check the weather when you are at the car park, check the weather when you're at the base of the climb, and keep checking the weather when you are doing the climb, if you can, if you have access to the internet on your phone. I've always done this. I've made sure that I've always done it even more after I read an article that Steve McClure wrote about when he tried to go rope soloing and he got totally shafted by the weather halfway up the route, and it basically nearly ended him in a really bad way, basically. And then on the other factors for security, yes, I do take a mobile phone. Tell somebody, at least one person, where you're going, all those kind of precautions that you would take when you're going climbing in the mountains, really. One thing that I should actually get better at, which I'm not very good at, is taking a small personal first aid kit. The final thing that you want to take is a knife. That is one thing that you should never get. I nearly ended in quite a funny situation when I went to solo the first few pitches of the nose, and I got to a little traverse to sickle ledge. My rope dropped down and it dropped down into a rope eating crack. Couldn't pull it out, so I had to abseil down, had to stand on this little ledge, and I was stood there for about 5 minutes, like, arse in the air, hands right down by the crack, just giving it everything to pull this rope out the crack. And I would have been I would have been fine if I couldn't get the rope out, because I could have called for somebody to come and help me. But that was one time I didn't bring a knife, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to look like a right flipping plonker if I'm stuck here, my rope is stuck, I haven't got a knife, and I can't get down off pitch 4 of the nose. I was pulling, and then suddenly it just like fired out the crack, and I was free, and then I got the hell out of there. Have I ever taken a fall whilst rope soloing where one or more pieces has failed? No. What would you say the most dangerous part of rope soloing is? Staying focused, not being able to discuss things with a partner, doing everything yourself, and you making all the decisions. That's probably the most dangerous thing about it, I think. The actual act of rope soloing and climbing a pitch, I've never found to be that dangerous. The thing that is dangerous is those big days, you're tired, and you're having to make those decisions on your own. What's the worst mistake I've made whilst rope soloing? This is an easy one for me. I remember it well. It was when I was rope solo free climbing Mount Watkins in Yosemite. I just led the crux pitch. It was basically the struggle of my absolute life, like clinging on for dear life to climb this thing. I got to the belay, my feet were on absolute fire. The crux pitch is kind of a leaning pitch. It kind of goes up in this direction. And I ended up, for some bizarre reason, coming down the pitch, cleaning the pitch the whole way down until I got to the last piece over here. And I got to this last piece, and then my belay was out over here. And I was like, I was really tired at the time, and I just thought, I'm going to take this piece out and I'm going to just take the ride across the slab, and I can swing and I can make a good landing. But there was a big corner over on this side. I took the piece out, I started running across the slab, and then I just literally, corner, it was like that. It was literally felt like hitting the floor. I smashed into it with my hand and my side. I lowered myself back to the ledge with the belay, but initially I thought I'd broken my wrist, but luckily I hadn't. And yeah, basically that was the biggest mistake I would say I've ever made, because what I should have done was I should have left all my pieces in and then stripped it on the way back up. Before we go into more rope solo questions, I just want to announce the sponsor of today's video, which is Skillshare. Skillshare is an online platform which I've been using over the last few months to improve my video editing. Recently, I've just finished a course by Ali Abdal, which takes you through a tutorial on Final Cut Pro, which is a video editing software which I upgraded to a few months ago. I know this video is quite basic in its filming and editing, but hopefully the regular viewers of the channel have seen some improvement in my videos from the birth of the channel until now. Those later improvements that I've made have been through the courses that I've taken on Skillshare. You know, there are loads of courses on this platform. I wouldn't say there's any rope soloing tutorials, but if you're looking for something creative which is a little bit more mainstream, then this is a platform with a wealth of information where you'll be able to find stuff. If you are interested in checking out the platform, then we at Boyz have a special link, and the first 1,000 people who click the link and sign up can get a free month of using Skillshare. When you sign up, not only do you get a free month, but you also really help us out on the channel. So give it a click, sign up, see what it's all about, learn something new. Thanks very much to Skillshare for sponsoring the video. Do I normally bring aid climbing gear? No, because I'm usually on free climbing missions. What's the most common mistake when learning to rope solo? Maybe the most common mistake is trying to copy what other people are doing. People love to try and know what I'm doing, but I'm not necessarily sure it's the best thing. But I think it's the best thing for me and my type of climbing and the risk that I'm happy to take. And I think what people do is they try and copy what other people are doing. But I always think with rope soloing, what you should do is you should pick elements from everybody's systems and then make a system yourself, and then be happy with that system and be happy with the risk of that system. Has anybody repeated my in a day rope solo without cap? No. Not that I know of. Rope soloing must be tedious. What do I do to ensure that I'm having a good time? To make sure I want to be there. Make sure you want to do the route. When you do bigger things, it can be quite overwhelming. So just taking it pitch by pitch and enjoying the pitch that you're doing, and then focusing on the next one when the previous is finished. So how do you do a traverse pitch whilst you're rope soloing? It's confusing as hell. What's the best way to do it? Yes, traverses, they're a nightmare. Basically, you have to climb the pitch 3 times. So if you were doing a traverse pitch, you would lead out on the bolted belay, you would traverse, and you would finish on the bolted belay here. One option is to fix hard here. You would climb, but on a Traxion or a Gri Gri or something, and you would back climb, clipping all your pieces of gear, and then you would get back to your start point here. You could tie into the end of the rope and then also put a Gri Gri on, for example, and then you'll climb again, taking in on the Gri Gri. You could rest on the piece of gear, and you would take the gear out as you went back to this point here. The next option is when you get to the end of the belay here, you can fix it in so you have a bit more slack in the system. Come back down, or you'd use your lowering device, so like a Gri Gri or something, you would lower back down and you'd have a Jumar on the rope pulling you in, so you'd be lowering down, Jumaring back across the traverse. And then what you would do is you'd take the pieces of gear out on the way back. Now this way you do end up in this like massive Y hang, and it can be quite sort of like awkward and bouncy, and sort of like you're lowering out a little bit, you're Jumaring up, you're lowering out, you're Jumaring up, you're taking pieces out, you're taking a little bit of a fall. But then when you get back to the belay, you have enough slack in the system, or you've left enough slack in the system, and then you can lower out. If this is a bolted belay, you can lower out on this bolted belay, do a normal lower out like you would, lower all the way out to below your other belay, pull your rope, and then Jumar back up to that belay. Now that system wouldn't work obviously if you're on a trad belay, because you can't retrieve that belay, that first belay, in which case you would have to use the first system of actually just like climbing the pitch 3 times. Okay, how to manage back feeding when you are halfway up the route. There's a lot of ways of doing this. Some people tie like bungee cords round bits of things and then they snap when it comes off and all this kind of stuff. But to be honest, like I've never ever done that. Maybe just because I'm free climbing, and it's just impossible to do when you're hard free climbing. You can't do it. Always just kept it really simple. I've just tied an overhand knot into a piece of gear and then clipped it in. You often get comments of like, oh, but then you're falling back onto that piece of gear, or like, oh, what if that piece of gear rips? The first thing, what if that piece of gear rips? Well, it doesn't matter if that gear rips because it's only there to hold the rope. The second thing is, what if that gear doesn't rip? Well, it doesn't matter if it doesn't rip. You've just created another belay in the middle of the route. And yes, you are going to take more of a shock fall because you've just created another belay within that route, but it's no different to taking a fall close to the belay where you were before. So I just keep it really simple, overhand knot, clip it into a piece of gear. Do I use backup knots, or is the idea never to fall? I don't use backup knots because when you're free climbing and when you're hard free climbing, the idea of trying to like tie backup knots, untie backup knots, have loads of loops of rope on pre-clipped onto your harness, it all just gets in the way. To be honest, it's a bit too much for me, so I opt not to tie backup knots. The only time I do tie backup knots, or backup knot in the rope, is if I'm potentially on a really hard pitch, and what I'll do is I'll look at the pitch first, I'll decide where the hard climbing is going to be, so it's going to be halfway up the pitch for example, and then I will tie a backup knot at 3/4 of the way through the rope. That way it's not going to get in the way of the hard climbing, but if the solar device, the system in the solar device did fail, then the backup knot would get caught in the system essentially. But the way I kind of see backup knots when you're free climbing rope soloing is that your first point of safety is your climbing. Your second point of safety is your equipment. So really we have got 2 points of safety here. We've got our climbing ability and we've got our solar device to catch us in a fall if we think we're going to fall off. If I was to start tying backup knots, that would actually affect my climbing and give me a higher risk of falling off, which is my first point of safety. It would affect my first point of safety by doing a third point of safety. However, you shouldn't, like I was saying earlier in this video, choose your own system. Don't do what other people do. Do what you are comfortable with doing. So don't do what I do. So why do I have a traction in the lead setup? The traction is used to keep the weight of the spare rope feeding into the device off the device directly so that it can feed properly. So which, in my opinion, is easier? Rope soloing or making friends to climb with you? Definitely rope soloing. What is your multi-pitch sequence? So when you get to the top of a climb, what do I do? How do I make it most efficient to like get to the top, get down, undo the last belay, Jumar back up? I will climb the pitch, I will get to the belay, I will pull up the end of the rope and I will attach that into the next belay, and that is going to be my starting point for the next pitch. To make sure there's not loads of slack in the system, I will then get the rope where I've just finished the pitch, where it's coming out the device, and I will then attach that into the belay, and then I'll abseil down off that point come all the way back down to the belay, and then I'll undo that belay, and then what I'll do is I'll attach the end of the rope to me, and I'll carry that up whilst I'm Jumaring. Then make myself safe, I will get the end of the rope that I've Jumared up with that's attached to me. I will then start stacking that into the bag. A good way to stack it is to actually run it up to a carabiner and then pull it down into the bag. And then eventually I'll get to the knots, which I use to abseil down on. I'll undo those knots, keep stacking, and then eventually I'll get to the very end of the rope, which is in the belay, which I clipped into when I got to that belay initially. That's going to be my starting point for the next pitch. I will then attach my solo device and all that kind of stuff, re-rack, and go. How do you set up a anchor on a bolted route when you're rope soloing? You use the first bolt and then you could redirect it through the second bolt. So what length and diameter of rope did I use on El Cat? A Sterling Marathon. I'm not sure what diameter that is, but that's what I used. What length of rope did I use? I think I had an 80-meter rope, and that was so I could combine pitches together. Do I always go fast and light? I do like going fast and light. I'm not much of a hauler, you could say. Do I ever use the continuous loop system? No. Thank you to Adam for joining us for this episode. Stayed quite quiet, but have you got anything to say, Adam? Anything you want to add to the rope solo conversation? There we go.